the book of Esther. It was so cultivating, so much of a blessing. We had so much of God's providence. And I want to thank God for the panelists led by Pastor Gigi Maina, supported by our brother Mavela, our sister Scholar, our brother Faris Maina, our brother Deacon Felix, and any other person that might have been involved, and particularly those who also contributed online. I want to register my appreciation. You did a good job. God bless you. We shall start another book today, the book of Nehemiah. And as we start the book of Nehemiah, I want to believe that it shall be a blessing to us. But before we go to the book of Nehemiah, allow me to share with you some of the thoughts that I have over and above what we have heard. We went through from the history and the history and the background of the book of Esther, and we went through that portion, and we looked at various themes. But one of the running themes in the book of Esther was the theme of God's providence. We started by saying that the book of Esther is one of those few books where the name of God is not expressly mentioned. However, there is traces and footsteps being seen of God's action. And I think, and that is what the panelists did through the period that we were doing this. And they did quite a good portion of work, and I want to appreciate them. But allow me to pick a few things, a few points today as we conclude the book of Esther. I know that we looked at the life of Esther, the rising of Esther from a niece to Mordecai, an orphan girl, from that level of a slave. A girl was in captivity, no parents, and being handled by the uncle Mordecai, and Esther rose up in ranks to the position of the queen of a foreign land, despite the fact that she was a foreigner in that particular land, and she was a captive. They were living in captivity, but God lifted her up all the way to become the queen. But I want to summarize this book by looking at two gentlemen, Mordecai and Naaman. I want us to look at Mordecai and Naaman. And I don't want to read the scriptures because we've already read through the scriptures. But I want you to just go back and see how Naaman rose to position of promotion. And he was second in command. He was followed. He was second to the king. And in that position, he commanded a lot of power. He had commanded a lot of influence in the land. But we start with a story of Naaman at the very high position, having been being promoted, and we see him coming down from a point of second in command to the point of being hanged, and the entire family of Naaman and the people that were in their village were all destroyed. What a tragedy. What a tragedy. What I see in this is, one, a lot of humility that is required. Even when one is lifted up in a position, and you are in a position of influence and a position of power, you need to be very careful, because power is good, and sometimes power can make one get drunk with it. And once you're drunk with power, then you can even lose it. We see Haman in that. One of the things that we see is that he decides to eliminate the Jews. And why is he eliminating the Jews? He's eliminating the Jews because of the behavior of one man who feared God and refused to worship idols or worship men or bow before men. He recognized that there is only one God of whom he ought to bow to. Then on the other hand, we see Mordecai. Mordecai We are not told how Mordecai gets himself to be serving at the gate, except that he was in captivity. But at the lowly position, he recognizes his two things. Number one, that he recognizes himself as a Jew, and there is only one true God whom he ought to worship. That became cardinal in his life, and he never wavered from his focus on God, and that was very strong. Number two, Mordecai recognized his responsibility at the gate. He kept the gate, and his responsibility, he guarded his responsibility so well, such that even when the enemies people wanted to overthrow the king, Mordecai did not care that he was a servant and actually a man in captivity. He would have said, to hell with this man, to hell with the king. He has brought us here as captives. Therefore, if somebody else is coming to overthrow him, let him be overthrown. But he understood his responsibility at that moment. He was not acting as a servant or as a slave, but as a watchman to the throne. And he took that so seriously, and he forgot about himself, but looked at the responsibility. Those two men are men that we can study. Mordecai and Haman. Two people in the same place, one in a lowly place as a gatekeeper, and also as a captive in that particular land. But he was committed and submitted himself to the king, and he understood his responsibility. Regardless of where he was, he did what was expected of him. Then on the other hand, we find Naaman, my apologies, Naaman and Haman. Haman, who was he himself from a native of that land, and he had been promoted to a position of power. But when he rose to the position of power, he felt the power around him, and he squandered his opportunity by wanting to go against others. And because of that, we see him coming down from a position of second in command to a position where he was hanged. For Mordecai is the other way around, and he rose up. By the end of the chapter, by the end of the book of Esther, we find Mordecai sitting as the second in command, a man who was the advisor to the king. And I see that these two men as men who we can learn from. Today, the fact that you are a man in a position does not mean that you can remain in that position. What will take you to that position up there will not necessarily maintain you at that position. A few points that I want to mention that will maintain you there. Number one, you must recognize the God who put you in that place. And there are a few things that I want to say here. In this particular book, we find a couple of things that we have read. Number one, God's providence. And we have seen this as a running theme throughout the book. Number two, we see God as a God of plan. We see God as a God of plan. God knew that at some point, because he understands the mind of man, he understands what people think about. And the Bible says that the heart of man is the most deceitful thing. Who can understand it? But God does understand the heart of man. Because God foresaw the plan that the Haman was about to bring or was going to bring, and he wanted to preserve his people. He wanted to preserve them, although they were in a foreign land. He made it that Vashti disobeys the husband and loses her position as a king, as a queen. Not really, in my opinion, not because she wasn't the right person, but because God wanted to fulfill this promise and to actually to confirm there is a God of providence and a God that can protect his people. So he swaps Vashti with Esther. because of what Mordecai told Esther. Who knows, maybe you are in that position for a time such as this. And I want to confirm, in my own opinion, that Esther got into that position not for her own self, but because of God. I mean, because of the people of God. Same with Mordecai. The third thing is that God is a God who avenges. Psalms, I think Psalms 35 says, God contends with those who contend with the righteous. And this is what we see in this particular book. Over and above what we have learned, we see God avenging Mordecai, and does not only avenge for him, but also lifts him up to the second position. So in the palace were two people. There was the queen and the uncle. Both of them seated at the palace, enjoying the providence of God. The third thing that we see is that is a God who restores. God restores the dignity. God restores that which we have lost. Mordecai had lost his dignity when he was at the gate. Esther had lost her dignity as a young girl and as an orphan. She was under care of an uncle. But look at the way God lifts her up. He does not only bring out the dignity in her and the beauty in her, but places her at the highest position in the land. That is the God that we believe in. Now, the other thing that I want to bring out is a God who establishes. God does not just lift us up. God does not just restore us. God does not just give us back our dignity, but God is a God who establishes us. We might have walked away from God. We might have gone astray. We might even be seen as if God is punishing us. But the day God remembers you, He will not only lift you up to a great position, but God will also establish you in the right position. And finally, on that particular front, God is a God of order. When you look at the entire book of Esther, you see things falling and unfolding one after another. And it's as if this had been choreographed. It is as if it had been planned. It's as if things were unfolding in a sequence that had already been pre-organized. Yes, it had been pre-organized, it had been predetermined, but not by man. It had been done so by God, because God did not only want to preserve the Mordecai and Esther in the palace, but God also intended to preserve the dignity of the people of Israel, those people who had been taken into exile. God had not forgotten them. And I want to also to state here that God has not forgotten you. You might be going through challenges. You might be seen as if you are serving at the gate. But I want to tell you that the God you serve is a faithful God. At the right time, He shall establish you. And when you look back, you will realize is that God had planned things for you. No wonder the book of Jeremiah, chapter number 29, verses 11 says, "For I have plans for you. I have plans for good and not evil, to give you a future and a hope." That is our God. He's a God of order. Let me switch on to the other side and look at Mordecai, Haman's side. Number one, we find that position sometimes can be deceptive, and there is always a fallacy that comes around, and what catches on people, and people get pride. They become proud when they rise up to position, and this is what is exhibited by Haman. By rising up to the second in command, he decides to do things his own way. But there is a God in heaven who is a God of equity, who is a God of justice. You cannot do unjust things, especially to the people of God, and you get away with it. This country has a lot of evidence of such kind of people who have taken advantage of the people of God, but they have not gone scot-free. God has avenged the people of God. The second thing is the danger of arrogance. When you rise up to a position of power, be careful not to be arrogant. It doesn't matter whether it's in the church, in the society, in your place of work. Exercise humility. Arrogance does not help. Humility lifts people up. And that is what we learn even from the life of Haman. Because of rising to position of power and exuding a lot of power, he became arrogant. But of course, when you become arrogant, also remember that there is a possibility of a reverse pain. And that is what we realize with Haman. Haman suffered the pain that he intended to bring on Mordecai. That is what I'm calling reverse pain. Do not wish people bad. Pray for them. Love them. Exercise justice if you have been put in a place of power. Because the reverse can happen to you. God can avenge those people whom you want to despise, or the people you despise. The other one is the agony of seeing your enemy rising up. And the very interesting story was the story of Haman going to plead with Esther. Haman going to plead with Esther. When we were looking at that, we saw the tragedy. You know, Haman has received information that the king is unhappy with him. And the only person who can save him is Esther, by pleading for forgiveness. So he goes to Esther to plead with Esther. But while he's pleading with Esther, the king comes into the chamber, and what he feels is that Haman wanted to defile the wife. And the king became even double-raged. He became more annoyed about it because he felt that he was not only going for the Jews, but even going for the queen. And that brought even much trouble to this man. I want to encourage you, do not look down upon others. You never know. They might have been put there for you as a test. You need to pass that test, the test of humility. I hope that summarizes it. Just to add on to what our very, very able expositors of the Bible did during that period we were looking at the book of Esther. Once again, I want to appreciate Pastor Gigi for leading the team, our sister Deacon Scholar, our brother Deacon Felix, our brother Mavela, our brother Faris Minor, and others who participated during this season. I also want to appreciate the GBI for the session they had. In fact, that was so timely for them when they were discussing the issues pertaining to the inner beauty. And what a wonderful session it was to look at the inner beauty that was brought out by Hadassah. God bless you. That brings us to the end of the book of Esther. And so, the next few minutes before we conclude, I want to look at another book, a very interesting book. This book mentions God several times, and so we will not have the to say that, to define and to defend that book. In fact, when we were starting and we were discussing, we were asking ourselves, how did Esther, the book of Esther, find its way in the Bible? And other books that mention God were left out. But I think through the scriptures we have understood that the subject, the theme that went through, the theme of God's providence came out so strongly. And we all agree, yes, it was necessary for those who were looking at the canon to look at having the book of Esther included in the books of canon. So God bless you and God keep you, the team that went through the book of Esther. Allow me to go into the Bible. We want to look at the book of Nehemiah. And my job is very, very simple, very cut out. It is about introducing the book of Esther. The book of Nehemiah. We are going to look at the book of Nehemiah. And I want to believe that we shall be able to cover this book before the end of this year. I know we are coming towards the end and there are many activities, but our Bible study continues despite the other activities that we have. So allow me to read Nehemiah chapter number 1, just as an introduction, to introduce who Nehemiah is, and we know that we shall continue on well. We believe that our system shall continue on until the end, and my technical team is very busy making sure that we have power, we have internet, and we are all alert. Welcome, Kevin Majoni. God bless you. Thank you, our brother Jagadi. Karibu sana. Nyambura Mugo. Karibu sana. God bless you. We are grateful to God that you are together with us. Thank you, Kiongozi Doris Wamboi. Thank you, our sister Elizabeth Ndegea. Your name is coming out as Elizabeth Wahito, and I'm sure you love that name. God bless you. We read Nehemiah chapter number 1, verses 1. I read up to verses 3, and then I introduce the book of Nehemiah. The word of Nehemiah the son of Hilkiah, it came to pass in the month of Chesley in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. Verses 3. And they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in the great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. Just coming from Esther, I expected somebody to be excited by the mention of citadel, because at Shushan, the citadel, and you know the massacre. Did we call it the massacre at the citadel? And the way God even commanded the people, the Jews, to go to citadel and not to take the spoil. Just do the job, just get in, do the job, kill, and get out. Citadel. Praise Shushan, the citadel. Now, so you can see the connection here, and Nehemiah is giving us an introduction of a situation that he was in. And by just mention of the broken walls of Jerusalem and the survivors of those people who went to captivity, or the survivors of the captivity, tells you that these scriptures were written during the time of captivity. It was during the days of captivity, and Nehemiah himself was held or was in captivity. And if you continue, you will find in down there that Nehemiah being introduced as a cupbearer in the king's palace. So just like Esther and Mordecai, Nehemiah was serving in the palace, and he was also a cupbearer. It is important for us to see the manner that these people, though in captivity, they served diligently, and even the king whom he was serving recognized him and even looked at the way he was behaving. The Bible actually records that he served so happily in the king's palace that even this day that when he got this message about the condition of Jerusalem, he was so downtrodden. He felt so bad, and his countenance changed. His countenance changed. And the king actually recognized that he was in distress. And he asked him, what is it that is bothering you? What is it that is challenging, or what is the problem? If you may allow me, because this is introduction, it's important for us to lay this foundation early, because once we read this, once we understand this, then the rest of the scriptures will be very nice for us. We shall be looking at, we shall be unearthing, just like we did the book of Esther, certain lessons that are written there. The Bible verses 4 says, so it was when I heard those words that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, I pray, Lord, God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandment. Please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you, both my father's house and I have sinned. And it continues on to pray before God. And this prayer was so touching to God. And then God started opening his heart and crying before God. So that is the introduction. But let me say this, that when you read the book of Nehemiah, just like in any other Bible study, we ask ourselves, who is Nehemiah? Where is Nehemiah coming from? Who is Nehemiah writing to? Who are the people whose message is being sent out? And what is the theme? What are we learning? Now, when we look at the book of Nehemiah, and you will realize this, you will find that Nehemiah is a prophet, is one of the prophets in the land of in Israel, amongst the people of God, and he is among his contemporaries. One of his contemporary is Ezra, and you'll find this. You'll find this in Ezra Nehemiah chapter number 7, and Nehemiah chapter from number 7 to number 12. You will find even the contribution of Ezra in this scripture. You'll also realize that Zerubbabel is also mentioned within this. So this could be most likely his contemporaries. Now, who wrote and why did he write? Now, from history and from the timelines that we look at, the time of Zerubbabel, who first of all left captivity and went back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. That was around 585. You will realize that they lived almost the same time. from the working, from the calculation of the dates, same time.